We have some breaking news this hour. Jack Smith, the special counsel, has new filing in the Mar-a-Lago documents case. In it, special counsel Smith asks the federal judge overseeing this case, that's Judge Aileen Cannon, to bar former President Trump from making statements that endanger law enforcement. This filing is in response to Trump this week complaining that standard boilerplate language contained in the FBI search warrant, which was used to search Mar-a-Lago in the summer of 2022. Trump is complaining that it was actually a secret attempt by Joe Biden to use the FBI to kill Donald Trump. This is an excerpt from that filing tonight on the part of Smith. Quote, Trump's repeated mischaracterization of these facts in widely distributed messages as an attempt to kill him, his family, and Secret Service agents has endangered law enforcement officers. Trump's conditions of release should therefore be modified to prohibit similar communications going forward. Back with me now are Susan Glasser, Brendan Buck, and Julian Castro. Susan, I go to you first on this just because this is a song we've heard before. Trump saying wild, implausible, and dangerous things that then put people in harm's way. However, the judge in this case, thus far, Aileen Cannon, has been very sympathetic to Donald Trump and has not been in much of a position to rule in favor of the special counsel. Do you have thoughts on this? Do you have a reaction to this?
Well, it's really notable that the special counsel has actually taken this to court. This was one of the wilder subplots of the week. Donald Trump embracing a new conspiracy theory, first promoted by some of his far-right allies like Marjorie Taylor Greene, basically distorting this, the raid at Mar-a-Lago into some sort of an effort to put him in the crosshairs of federal law enforcement's guns. It even prompted a very unusual statement from Merrick Garland himself, the attorney general, saying that this wasn't true. Donald Trump, nonetheless, not only promoting it on his Truth Social media platform, but even raising money off of it. If you get those emails in your inbox, it says, Joe Biden tried to kill me. Literally. And it's a good example where Trump is used to never having any accountability for the wild, false allegations that he is used to spreading. And so, we'll see. I think you rightly pointed out the judge here has been quite sympathetic to Donald Trump and has effectively, in her rulings, made it impossible for this case to go to court before the election. So the American people won't have the benefit of knowing whether Trump will be found guilty of a very serious set of charges that involve him illegally taking scores of very classified, top secret documents from the White House with him and misusing or certainly keeping that information unsafe in his bathroom, in his bedroom. It's really a remarkable case all around, but I don't know if she'll sanction him or not.
Well, and as the hush money trial proves, Brendan, even if Trump stops saying it, that doesn't mean other people in the Republican Party will. And I have to say, looking at this week, the narrative that Joe Biden tried to assassinate Donald Trump feels like one of those weeds that left untended in the garden spreads everywhere. I mean, you already have Steve Bannon saying it. You have the far-right MAGA caucus in the Republican conference bandying this about. I do wonder, not on this network, not in, traditional mainstream media, not on Earth One, but in other parts of the internet and right-wing echo chambers, whether this thing has legs.
Yeah, that was actually my first reaction. I don't know what the judge is going to do in the case, but it reminds me how scary politics can be right now. If you take at face value what he is saying, he's putting in danger the lives of law enforcement. To me, that says that there are a bunch of people in the FBI who are probably being sort of tracked down on the internet and being threatened by crazy people who are hearing crazy stuff on the internet. And that is sort of the reality that we don't hear a lot about in politics today, but it affects, elected officials. It affects all kinds of places. We saw it down in Georgia, the woman who was pestered based on what Rudy Giuliani said. This is a scary place, and the way that information flows around can be really disturbing. And I imagine I expect this is probably something from a very practical or something that actually took place that triggered it, and that's scary.
Secretary Castro, it's also the way Trump demands fealty from all those who serve him, right? The notion that, it's similar to the 2020 big lie, right? Once he has a theory, once he has a theory in his mind, he's like a dog with a bone, and he won't let go of it, and he won't let anyone around him let go of it, which is why the Republican Party is to some degree in the position that it is vis-a-vis election interference and the stolen 2020 election. I just wonder, we're talking about who Trump's going to get to be his running mate. The Veep stakes has been a subject of much discussion this week. There's a new entrant to that race, Tom Cotton, the senator. And I just wonder, of the selection of people who have been, names bandied about, whether it's Doug Burgum, whether it's Tim Scott, whether it's Tom Cotton, whether it's Marco Rubio, are those the kind of people that are willing to lay their conscience at the door in the way that being Donald Trump's running mate would demand?
Gosh, Alex, I mean, you had a great line last week with it being a swimsuit competition, all the folks marching up to testify for, basically defend him in New York. But yeah, I mean, it seems so, right? And as shocking as that is, you take somebody like Marco Rubio or a couple of those others that you mentioned, right after January 6th, they went up there to the well of the Senate chamber, the House chamber, or, at a press conference, and they condemned what had happened on January 6th. Some of them even condemned or blamed Donald Trump for it. And here we are, getting ready for the 2024 election after they had put the blame on him, after they had written him off, and now they're marching to his defense. They're all scurrying to try and figure out how they can get to #1 on his VP list. And politicians, when they do this, they do that because they think that there's a direct reward. For these guys, it's either the reward is that they're going to become, his vice presidential selection, and or that they're going to get to keep their position because they're so scared of what would happen to them politically if they angered his base, that they would get a primary challenge, and that primary challenge might be able to beat him, that they just think it's easier to give in and to show that fealty publicly. They have to do it so publicly and make sure that that base knows that, no, I was with Donald Trump, no matter what happens to him. That's where we're at. We're at this very weird, twisted echo chamber, all of Donald Trump's creation, that has turned the Republican Party from a party that arguably, under Reagan, even though I didn't like the principles, actually stood for some principles, to now, as many people have pointed out, really more like a cult.
Yeah, well, can I ask you, Susan? I mean, you were talking about Nikki Haley earlier in the hour, and I just wonder what you think she's getting out of this, her endorsement of Donald Trump. She didn't say her supporters should and must follow him at the ballot box, but she said she was going to support Trump because Biden had been such a catastrophe. What does she actually get out of this?
Nikki Haley is one of the serial flip-floppers on Donald Trump in the Republican Party today. She's not the only one. But remember, she was against him, then she was for him, then she was against him again, then she was against him too early, so then she was sort of for him again, then she was against him, then she was even more against him, and now she's back to being for him. So it's pretty exhausting. She's relying on the template that has become the standard template this year. If people like Mitch McConnell, who literally has not spoken with Donald Trump since after the 2020 election, Mitch McConnell, who blamed Donald Trump for personally inciting the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, and yet is willing to say that he's endorsing and voting for him. Chris Sununu, the governor of New Hampshire, again, a scathing critic. I know for sure that Marco Rubio and Tom Cotton are under no illusions about Donald Trump. It's not like he's converted them to the religion of Donald Trump. And so it speaks much more to the incentive structure in the Republican Party today, per the secretary's observations, which I think is right on the mark. It's about ambition. It's about what the definition of what it means to be a Republican is. But for Donald Trump, we haven't talked about that much. I would just throw out there in this Veep stakes that Donald Trump believes that he was betrayed by Mike Pence on January 6th. It seems to me the one thing he's really looking for in a vice president is the most servile person without principles who will do whatever he says. That, in fact, is the criteria here. I don't think Donald Trump is looking for very much political help from a vice presidential candidate. He believes it's all about him in the end. And I just think loyalty is the thing we should be looking at.
Right. He's not looking to carry Arkansas. He's already got that one. He just needs the most spineless person among them. Susan Glasser, Brendan Buck, Julian Castro, thank you all for spending your Friday night with me. I really appreciate it.
This is the fifth week that President Trump has been in court for this sham of a trial. They are doing this intentionally to keep him here and keep him off of the campaign trail. And I think everybody in the country can see that for what it is.
That was Speaker of the House, Republican Mike Johnson, talking to reporters outside the Manhattan criminal courthouse last week, repeating Donald Trump's favorite lines: the hush money trial is a sham and everyone knows it. Reality suggests otherwise. According to a new CBS poll, 56% of Americans believe Trump is definitely or probably guilty of a crime in this case. What is true, though, is that the Speaker's decision to appear outside the Manhattan courtroom and attack the judicial branch is emblematic of the complete capitulation of Republican leadership to Donald Trump. As the Washington Post editorial board notes, in hindsight, the Stormy Daniels and the Access Hollywood tape episode was the beginning of Mr. Trump's unconditional hold on the Republican base and the beginning of the end for what was left of the traditional GOP. I am back with George Conway, Charles Coleman, and Anna Bower. Thank you all for being here. George, I butchered the quote, but I do wonder what you think of it. Is this, I mean, in some ways, this represents bookends of the Trumpification of the Republican Party, Access Hollywood and Stormy Daniels being the beginning, and the Speaker of the House coming to the rescue of a potential felon outside a Manhattan courtroom.
Well, they always manage to sink lower. I mean, here you have the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States of America, who is a conservative evangelical Christian, telling outright lies about a trial in defense of an adjudicated rapist who he knows lies in almost everything he does, and is. No, this isn't a sham trial. The evidence is there. The grand jury indicted him. What does he have to say about the evidence that involves, not really in dispute, the person he's lying for, this conservative Christian evangelical, who paid off a porn star that he had sex with, very briefly, and then covered it up with a payoff? I mean, what is he saying is the lie there? He's lying, and he's lying in defense of a pathological liar and criminal, and as I mentioned, an adjudicated rapist. You just can't sink any lower than that. And this is, I mean, the entire right has succumbed to this level of degeneracy and treats it as normal and just pretends it doesn't exist. It's absolutely appalling.
Yeah, it is not normal. I think it bears repeating. And I do wonder, Anna, you've spent time in the courtroom. You've been following this religiously almost. The effect that all of this is having on the jury, I mean, they're obviously not outside the courtroom, but there's been this parade of Trump allies through the courtroom. And this, the Trump of it all. Can you give us a sense of how the jury has been processing this from what you've been able to see inside the courtroom and in the overflow room?
Right. Well, look, I can't get inside the jurors' minds, but I can tell you that sometimes whenever the parade of Trump's entourage comes in, it can be disruptive. There was a moment even at a sidebar that we learned from the transcript later on in which prosecutors asked Justice Merchan to ensure that perhaps people who are coming into the courtroom during trial proceedings could, do so more quietly because their security services were following them, all of that. So there's that element to it where it is a little bit distracting. I'm sure it is not lost on the jurors who are watching these political figures come into the courtroom every day. And then what also is likely not lost on the jurors is the fact that there are some notable absences from that courtroom, particularly Melania Trump, as well as Trump's daughters, Ivanka, Tiffany. None of those people have been there while Trump's sons have attended the trial on some days. This is a case in which the defense is arguing that Trump cares about his family, that he cared about his reputation and his relationship with his wife. And they're arguing that through their cross-examination and through their case to the jurors. And yet all the while, Melania Trump is not there. So it really is a striking absence sitting there in the courtroom. And I'm sure that is not lost on the jurors.
Anna, let me just ask you one more question, because the jurors have not been talking amongst themselves. Is that right? I mean, we haven't seen any interaction there, which is, I would assume, making it even harder to understand what the dynamics are among that group of 12 people.
That's right. And I will say there are a few jurors where I've noticed that maybe one or two will kind of smile at each other at certain moments. But there's, especially during the trial proceedings, they are very engaged. They are paying attention, looking at, just the witness and the prosecutor or the defense counsel who's doing the questioning. They're not talking amongst themselves. So we really don't have much of an idea of what the dynamic there is. And they're also not supposed to be, speaking about the case to each other or to other people. The judge every day when we leave gives them instructions to that effect. So we don't have much insight into the dynamics, although we do know a few things. For example, there are two lawyers on this jury. And so you have to wonder exactly how that could affect the dynamic within the deliberation room when they eventually do get there. Are these two lawyers people who will kind of be natural leaders among the jury in terms of explaining this very complicated legal theory?
No matter what the outcome is, Charles, it's very clear that Donald Trump doesn't want to have to go through this again. Rolling Stone, I mean, to some degree, I understand. But the remedies he's seeking are unprecedented, right? Rolling Stone is reporting that Trump wants lawmakers to pass legislation to keep him out of jail forever. It's a twofold strategy. One, asking them to pass a law to shield former presidents from prosecution forever. And two, give former presidents the option of moving state or local prosecutions into a federal court instead. That's something he tried to do in Georgia. What is your reaction to that strategy?
Well, I find it interesting because for as much as people said that Donald Trump did not understand government during his first term in office, it's very clear that since that time, he has learned how to use the legislature as a sword and a shield, and he intends to do so going forward. We all know that part of the reason why Donald Trump is running for the White House is because he wants to avoid landing in the big house. But at the end of the day, even if that is not something that he has direct control over, what he knows he can do is apply pressure to not only the legislature, but also to the judiciary, where he has a supermajority on the Supreme Court that will do hopefully some of the things, if not all of the things that he wants them to do. I thought it was very interesting in your lead-in. You talked about the fact that Mar-a-Lago, for example, the federal case in Florida with the documents, is the most straightforward case that federal prosecutors have, and perhaps any of the cases that he's facing. And simultaneously, it's the case where he's getting the most help from the bench in terms of Eileen Cannon, a Trump-appointed judge who has basically put that trial on hold. So when I look at all of this, Alex, what I see is someone who really understands I need to attack this problem on multiple fronts, leave no stone unturned, and create every opportunity for myself to stay out of court any further.
Well, and he's banking, George, on the fact that, you had the Speaker of the House and enough Republicans standing on the courthouse steps that they had to push off a vote on a bill to hold Merrick Garland in contempt down in Washington, D.C. He has the support of the Republican conference in the House. And is it so far-fetched to imagine that they would pass a law that's, by the way, already been a bill that's already been drafted to make sure he's immune from prosecution forever? Yeah,
I mean, I think the House would probably pass it. I mean, the House is completely in the thrall of Donald Trump. And they probably pass by 1 or 2 votes, the margin that they have. But I don't think it would pass the Senate. I don't think they would have all of even the Republican senators to sign on to that bill. I think there are plenty of Republican senators who would find it completely repulsive. But I agree with Charles. I mean, he will use this is all about Trump. Trump is running for president to stay out of the big house, as Charles said. He is going to use every lever of government or politics, anything, or the media, to stay out of jail. And then, if he manages to become president and to stay out of jail, to wreak vengeance upon everyone who crossed him. And that's what Donald Trump is about, because Donald Trump is just about himself. He's a narcissistic sociopath. He has no morals, no conscience, no remorse. And he's the only one in his own world, and he's the only one he cares about. And, the government be damned. Soldiers who died for their country, they're suckers and losers. Everyone else doesn't count in the mind of Donald Trump, and certainly the rule of law doesn't.
There we are. George Conway, Charles Coleman, and Anna Bower. Thank you all for spending your Friday Memorial Weekend Eve with me and giving us the goods on what you think is going to happen. I really appreciate your time and wisdom. Enjoy your weekends, friends. If you wanted to attend Donald Trump's campaign fundraiser in Houston this past Wednesday, a ticket would have cost you a whopping $250,000. This was obviously not an event that was marketed to working class or ordinary Americans, but specifically to oil tycoons. At that very fundraiser, Trump promised the big oil executives in the room more drilling and even fewer regulations. All they had to do, Trump said, was to be generous, please. Well, they complied. Trump's big oil fundraiser raked in $25 million for his campaign in just one day. Joining me now is Faz Shakir, former campaign manager for Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign and founder and executive director of More Perfect Union. Faz, thank you for joining me, man. What a study in contrast. Biden's war against junk fees and Trump's promises to a room full of the ultra-wealthy.
Alex, that's not the only fundraiser, and it's been a pattern with Trump. He actually held a fundraiser at John Paulson, who's a hedge fund billionaire's house a few months ago, said, we'll lower your taxes. Just make sure you give money to us. And by the way, we're speaking on a day when today he secured the endorsement of a guy named Steven Schwarzman, one of New York's wealthiest people, one of the biggest and richest persons in the world who controls so much of the housing market. He says, I endorse Donald Trump because his direction for the economy would be better. Why do they all love that, Alex? What is it that the billionaire class loves?
What is it,
Donald
Faz?
Trump?
What is it? What do they like so much about Donald Trump?
Right now, you have the Chamber of Commerce, you've got major credit card companies, you've got Ticketmaster, as you mentioned, you've got big oil companies all fighting Joe Biden in court. They're fighting an agenda that is working on behalf of the people. You see a billionaire class who's pretty upset. That why would you dare to challenge our business practices that give us so much wealth when you go in and challenge Ticketmaster's business monopoly, when you challenge a Kroger and Albertsons merger, when you challenge Apple's monopoly over the iPhone market? Why are you guys doing that? Get out of our way. And here's the Biden administration fighting the people's fight, saying this is a basic fight, people versus the powerful. We're going to enact a government that is going to take the side of the working class. And that story is what is going on. You see the billionaire class revolt against it. And I hope that more people out there know that Biden is taking on these courageous fights on their behalf.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's talk about that for a minute, because it's clear that the Biden administration is doing this because of a sort of ethical drive, right? This is a wrong thing that's happening. This is, the American worker is being screwed over, pardon my French, at the hand of big corporate profits. It is also very clearly a proxy war against inflation, is it not, Faz? I mean, the Biden administration keeps getting hit on the economy for reasons that have to do with a lot more than just the economy, and needs to show that they are concerned about inflation, that they care about how much money Americans are having to shell out on a daily basis. Is this the best way to do it?
Yeah, well, I mean, inflation in general, as we know, part of the major story there is that corporate America has too much control over the ability to jack up your prices, and they have taken advantage of that. One of the most important things we learned in the past few weeks was brought to us by the Federal Trade Commission, in which they said that there was collusion going on in which domestic oil producers, namely a guy named Scott Sheffield, who heads one of the most important oil industry here in America, was colluding with OPEC across the seas, saying, let's keep prices high out of the pandemic. They come out of the pandemic and they say, let's keep prices high. And that, when you think of when oil is kept high, what happens to the rest of the economy? Well, you have a trickle-down effect all over the place where everybody else's cost of transportation and goods goes up. And here you had the FTC referred this case to the DOJ for criminal prosecution. Here you have the Biden administration going after criminally illegal price fixing. Is it going to solve the problem immediately? No. But there is going to be accountability over people who price gouged Americans. And that's as much as you can ask at this moment, because the structural problem of corporate America having too much power to control your prices is not easy to fix. But the unrigging of the American economy is what Joe Biden is after, and he's doing a good job of it. And obviously Donald Trump is promising a different course of action, which is, hey, why don't we side with big business and just let them do whatever the hell they want?
Well, really, honestly, re-rig the economy.
Yeah.
It's like the unrigging versus re-rigging. I mean, Biden's also canceling a lot of student loan debt, which is something, honestly, that does not get covered as much as it should. But I do wonder if you think these measures are reaching the people they need to, right? I mean, concert fees, credit card fees, airline fees, that's reaching a certain subsection of the American, working class, of the American electorate. Student loan debt is another. Together, is this holistically reaching the number of people, the kinds of people that are not already on the side of Joe Biden?
Not yet, but I think there's 5 to 6 months to go here, and I think there's a zeitgeist out there, Alex, about people in the working class who, understandably, coming out of the pandemic, pretty frustrated, feeling economically precarious. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily, doing poorly economically, but feeling uncertain, unsure, a malaise of a kind of affecting their behavior and the mood. And I think while there are people, you have to meet people where they're at. If you're feeling frustrated about an economy, you don't go and tell them everything is amazing. You level with them about the fact that there's a fight to be had here about whether and who to trust to try to fix this economy on your behalf. Who has the credibility to lower prescription drug prices, to go after big oil companies when they collude, to go after major food producers and meat packers when they are gouging prices on you? Who's going to do that? And I think if that's the choice posited, that's why these debates are going to be so important, because I don't know what Donald Trump thinks about a Ticketmaster lawsuit. Do you? We haven't heard him talk about any of this stuff. And I'm hoping that once Joe Biden is able to present, here's a course on the economy that I am taking, that I am on a certain track, and I'm asking you for more time to work on this, versus that guy who wants to lower taxes for billionaires and wants to give them the rule of the roost again. I think that choice has not yet been clarified, and partly because they haven't engaged each other on their, respective plans, and I'm hoping that happens here very, very soon.
June 27th, we're looking at you. Maybe once Cats tickets go on sale on Ticketmaster, Donald Trump will have an opinion. His favorite musical. Faz Shakir, thank you again for your time this Friday night and your general enthusiasm about what is possible. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Alex.
It has been less than a month since a law went into effect in Florida banning most abortions. And yet already we are seeing the ripple effects of that. The Washington Post reports on a new study today showing that wait times for abortions in nearby states across the East Coast are up nearly 30% since that Florida law went into effect. North Carolina clinics appear to be suffering the most from the increased patient load. Wait times in North Carolina have risen in half the clinics in that state. Now, it is not a surprise that neighboring states, once not as hostile to abortion, are feeling the effects of Florida's abortion ban. But what is surprising is the effect on those states is perhaps not quite as severe as expected. According to abortion clinic staffers in Florida, fewer women appeared to be leaving the state for abortion care than was widely expected, a finding largely attributed to the increasing availability of telemedicine and abortion pills. It's a good reminder that in a post-Roe world, the landscape of abortion access has changed dramatically thanks to the abortion medications mifepristone and misoprostol, which are being sent through the mail into states that have banned abortion. But that has made medication abortion the next target for the anti-abortion movement, with a case that could severely curtail nationwide access to mifepristone that's currently pending before the Supreme Court. And just today, Louisiana became the first state in the nation to criminalize not the use of abortion pills, but the possession of the medications without a prescription. That law was passed yesterday by the Louisiana Senate, and tonight it was signed into law by the state's Republican governor. Once the law takes effect, people in Louisiana could be thrown in prison for up to 5 years just for having abortion pills in their possession. Joining me now is Amanda Zurawski. She nearly died in 2022 when she was denied a medically necessary abortion in the state of Texas, which of course has banned nearly all abortions. She is now suing the state, trying to challenge its bans. Amanda, thank you so much for being here, and thank you as always for sharing your story. I do wonder, what your reaction is to the news out of Louisiana tonight, which is Republicans acting to take one of the last remaining tools out of the hands of women seeking to assert control over their own bodies.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back. In regards to Louisiana, first and foremost, my heart just shatters for all of the people in Louisiana who are now going to suffer under this new law. And frankly, it's terrifying. As you mentioned, very similar consideration is in front of the Texas Supreme Court where I live, and it's just absolutely terrifying. I truly can't believe that we are living in this dystopian reality where we can be punished, we can be criminalized, we can be jailed for accessing basic health care. And make no mistake, this is a direct result of Donald Trump and his overturning of Roe v. Wade, which, by the way, he continues to brag about. And if he's reelected, we know that he will make this an issue across the country, and it's absolutely terrifying.
You know, you mentioned the word criminalization, which I think is so important in all of this. It's the idea of the punitive nature of all of this. Women being criminalized for having abortion medication, which is, you know, entirely safe, has been for decades, has been approved by the FDA. Women criminalized for trying to cross the border to seek abortions in other states. But it's this notion that the law is cracking down on the people who seek to control their own bodies. And I wonder, as a woman who was in that situation, what it feels like to be told and to be positioned by the state as someone who is doing something criminally wrong.
It's unbelievable. It's unthinkable that there are politicians like Donald Trump who are trying to criminalize us for making decisions for our own bodies. These are decisions that should be between a woman and her healthcare provider. This is not something that politicians need to have their hands in. I don't think Donald Trump or his MAGA allies know better than my doctors. And so why do they think they have any business telling me how to make my own healthcare decisions?
You know, it feels like, you know, the first front was abortion. Then we're talking about IVF and embryos. We're now talking about abortion medication. Contraception is on the table. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about your personal struggle with IVF, given what happened to you and your body as a result of the Texas law, and what you're doing to sort of manage the increasingly dim landscape for women seeking any kind of reproductive assistance.
It's interesting for me because on the one hand, I fall under the category of being unable to receive an abortion when I needed one. And, you know, MAGA Republicans and Donald Trump are saying because that's pro-life. But then on the other hand, now because of what I went through, because of the ban in Texas, that is a result of Donald Trump, I have to pursue IVF to try to build my family. And now MAGA Republicans are trying to tell us if and when and how we can access IVF. And so to me, it feels very much about control. And again, I don't think politicians have any business having their hands in my family planning journey or telling me when or where or how I can build a family. And so it's really disheartening, but it's also motivating to fight back because we can change this and we can fix this as long as we make sure that Donald Trump is not reelected.
I know that you've spoken publicly about your decision to move your embryo. Why don't you I don't want to put words in your mouth, but could you tell us a little bit how you've made family planning decisions? I mean, it truly feels like in this journey, you've been treated like a criminal on the run. And every time you see a path towards having a family, it's like there's someone that comes out of the corner with a new regulation.
That's exactly right. And you know, that's what I mean when I say this feels like it's about control. You're exactly right. My husband and I are very happy to have a number of embryos that we're hoping will one day become children. But when the Alabama Supreme Court ruling came out earlier this year, we were absolutely terrified. And so we instantly made the decision to move our embryos out of Texas because we know the political landscape in Texas is very similar to Alabama. And so we moved them somewhere that we felt they would be safer. But there is still a great deal of fear because, again, if Donald Trump is reelected, it won't matter what state our embryos are in because they won't be safe anywhere.
Yeah, well, he's looking for the Comstock, whether the Comstock Act or a national abortion ban. There are options that are very much on the table should he win the presidency again in 2024. Amanda Zurawski, thank you for being here. Thank you for telling us about intimately the struggles that you have been going through just as a woman trying to deal with her own body in the 21st century. I appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.